I never imagined that a tattered copy of Think and Grow Rich, gifted to me on my 16th birthday, would alter the course of my life. Just like I'll never forget the day my parents announced they were setting aside $1 million for my brother, Marcus's MBA at Harvard, while handing me a $24.99 paperback with a dismissive, "This is more your style, Eliza." Those moments of blatant favoritism carved wounds deeper than anyone could see. But they also planted the seeds for a success story nobody, especially not my family, could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I realized I was invisible in my own family was during a chilly spring evening when I was 9 years old. I had spent weeks coding a simple video game where players could build and manage their own virtual businesses. Nothing fancy, by today's standards, but remarkable for a child who had taught herself programming through library books and free online resources. "Dad, look what I made," I called out as my father, Richard Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Communications, walked through the front door of our spacious Seattle home. I turned my laptop screen toward him, eager to show how players could customize their virtual storefronts and manage inventory. My father barely glanced at the screen. "That's nice, Eliza," he muttered, his eyes already searching the room for my brother. At that moment, Marcus bounded down the stairs waving his report card. "Dad, I got elected class president and made honor roll again," Marcus announced, his perfectly styled hair and confident smile mirroring our father's polished appearance. Dad's face transformed instantly. "That's my boy," he exclaimed, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Leadership and academics, the perfect combination. This calls for a celebration." He turned toward the kitchen. "Catherine, come see what your son accomplished." My mother emerged from the kitchen, her elegant figure highlighted by an expensive designer dress, despite it being a random Tuesday at home. "What wonderful news, darling," she gushed, embracing Marcus while my father already had his phone out, making dinner reservations at Canlis, Seattle's most exclusive restaurant. I sat there, laptop still open to my creation, as they discussed. Which relatives needed to hear about Marcus's achievements immediately? Eventually, I closed my computer and slipped upstairs to my room. No one noticed my absence. This wasn't an unusual occurrence in the Blackwell household. It was the established pattern. Marcus, 3 years my senior, was the golden child. Captain of the debate team, excellent student, socially confident, and possessing what my parents called executive presence, even as a teenager. My parents built their universe around nurturing his potential, seeing in him the perfect successor to Blackwell Communications, the telecommunications company my father had transformed from a small, regional provider into a Pacific Northwest powerhouse. I, meanwhile, was the afterthought. Where Marcus inherited our father's confident charisma and business instincts, I was quiet and analytical, preferring to solve problems through code rather than conversation. Where Marcus excelled at public speaking and leadership, I thrived in data analysis, technological innovation, and spotting market inefficiencies, areas my parents considered back-office functions, rather than the stuff of true business leadership. "Eliza, why can't you be more outgoing like your brother?" became the unofficial soundtrack of my childhood, playing on repeat at family gatherings, school functions, and holiday dinners. Our home in Medina, Washington was spectacular by any standard. A modernist waterfront mansion with 5 bedrooms, a home theater, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Washington. But within those architecturally significant walls existed 2 completely different childhoods. Marcus's bedroom was a testament to his achievements, with trophies lining custom shelves, framed certificates, and the latest technology my father believed would prepare him for business leadership. My room, though equally spacious, contained mostly books on coding and investment strategy, a self-built computer, and journals filled with business ideas that no one ever asked to see. The disparity extended beyond our bedrooms. Marcus's debate tournaments warranted family trips across the country. My coding competitions weren't worth the 30-minute drive. Marcus's 18th birthday featured a yacht party on Lake Washington with 100 guests. Mine was acknowledged with a dinner at home and practical gifts like clothes and a laptop for schoolwork. When I turned 14, I overheard my mother talking to her friend Jennifer during their weekly tennis match at the country club. "It's just perplexing," my mother sighed, adjusting her tennis bracelet. "We gave Marcus every opportunity, and he's flourishing exactly as we hoped. Eliza has access to the same resources, but she's just different. Always hiding behind her computer, starting these little online projects that never amount to anything. Obsessing over tech stocks instead of building social connections." Jennifer nodded sympathetically. "Some children just don't fit the profile, Catherine. Not everyone has that executive DNA." "I suppose you're right," my mother agreed. "We should just be grateful that Marcus is so eager to join Richard at the company after college. He's already talking about innovative ways to expand our market share." Their words sliced through me. Not everyone has that executive DNA. The casual dismissal of my potential, the reduction of my passion for technology to childish hobbies, the assumption that I was somehow deficient rather than different. It crystallized everything I'd felt but couldn't articulate for years. That evening, I locked myself in my room and cried until my eyes burned. Not the dramatic tears seeking attention, but the quiet sobs of someone grieving the parental recognition they would never receive. The next morning, I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. If I couldn't earn my parents' recognition through their approved channels, I would build something they couldn't ignore. I would prove my worth not by conforming to their expectations, but by exceeding them in ways they hadn't imagined possible. I started small, using $3,000 I had saved from birthdays and my modest allowance to build a simple app that helped small businesses optimize their telecommunications services. Having grown up hearing countless discussions about pricing structures and service packages at Blackwell Communications, I understood the industry's inefficiencies and pain points for smaller clients who lacked negotiating power. My app, initially called Telecompare, allowed small business owners to input their communications needs and receive unbiased recommendations for the most cost-effective service packages, including those offered by my father's competitors when they provided better value. I worked nights and weekends, teaching myself additional programming languages as needed, marketing through online forums for small business owners, and gradually building a user base through word of mouth. Within 4 months, I had turned my initial investment into $12,000 through a simple freemium model. By 8 months, I had hired 2 college students as part-time developers to help manage the growing platform. Telecompare wasn't revolutionary, but it was profitable and useful, qualities I thought might finally earn my parents' respect. One evening at dinner, I gathered my courage to share my success. "I've started a business helping small companies optimize their telecommunications services," I announced during a rare lull in conversation. "It's going really well. I've made almost $20,000 in the past 8 months. My father paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "A business? You mean like a school project?" "No, it's a real business," I explained, enthusiasm creeping into my voice, despite my efforts to remain casual. "I've developed an algorithm that analyzes telecommunications needs and finds the best service packages. I've already helped over 50 small businesses reduce their communications costs by an average of 22%. For a moment, one glorious moment, I saw something flicker in my father's eyes. Interest, recognition. I couldn't be sure, but it was the closest thing to approval I'd ever received from him. But before he could respond, Marcus interjected. "Dad, I just got invited to join the Young Entrepreneurs Association at Princeton. The president said they rarely accept freshmen." And just like that, the moment evaporated. My father's attention swung back to Marcus like a compass finding north, his face lighting up with familiar pride. That's incredible, son. Those connections will be invaluable. We should send a thank you to the Henderson family. Their daughter was in that group last year, wasn't she? The conversation spiraled from there, with my parents enthusiastically discussing Marcus's networking opportunities at Princeton, while my business achievement faded into background noise, acknowledged but ultimately deemed unworthy of sustained interest. Later that night, as I updated my business spreadsheets, I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. It was my grandmother, Helen Blackwell, the only person in the family who seemed to truly see me. Grandma Helen was nothing like my parents. Before marrying my grandfather, she had been one of the first female systems analysts at Boeing in the 1970s, with a mathematical mind and appreciation for technological innovation that made her the only person who understood my passion for coding and data. "I heard about your business at dinner," she said, settling into the chair beside my desk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. $20,000 in 8 months is impressive by anyone's standards. I shrugged, trying to appear less hurt than I felt. Not impressive enough, apparently. Grandma Helen's eyes softened. Your parents are limited by their own vision. Eliza, they only recognize success that matches their specific definition of it. Which is exactly what Marcus represents, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Yes, but that's not a reflection of your value, she replied firmly. It's a reflection of their blind spots. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small flash drive. I want you to have this. It's something your grandfather was working on before he died. I took the drive carefully. What's on it? Alexander was developing an algorithm for predictive analysis of telecommunications market trends, she explained. He believed the industry was going to undergo massive disruption, but Richard was focused on scaling the existing business model when he took over. Your grandfather never got to implement his ideas. I plugged the drive into my computer, scanning through folders containing market research, predictive models, and financial projections that were remarkably forward-thinking, despite being nearly a decade old. Your father has turned Blackwell Communications into a successful regional provider, Grandma Helen said. But he's forgotten the innovative thinking that created it. He's built walls instead of bridges, stability instead of adaptation. That may work for him and for Marcus, but it doesn't mean your path is any less valuable. Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit. For the first time, someone was acknowledging that my different approach wasn't a deficiency, but a valid alternative. Perhaps even an advantage in the rapidly evolving telecommunications landscape. Keep building, Eliza, she urged, squeezing my hand. Not for their approval, but because it's who you are. The right people will recognize your value eventually. The next 3 years passed in a blur of academic requirements and entrepreneurial growth. Telecompare evolved into Telesavvy, expanding beyond comparison tools into comprehensive telecommunications management services for mid-sized businesses. I taught myself cloud architecture, data security protocols, and enterprise software development through online courses and relentless trial and error. My academic performance remained solid, though not exceptional like Marcus's. I focused my energy on practical business experience rather than perfect grades, a strategy that frustrated my parents but aligned with my strengths and vision. When college acceptances arrived, Marcus was admitted to Princeton's prestigious Woodrow Wilson School with a leadership scholarship, triggering a celebration that included a catered party at our home with my father's business associates and family friends in attendance. 2 weeks later, I received my acceptance to MIT with a substantial merit scholarship based on my technical portfolio and business achievements. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were having breakfast and placed the acceptance letter on the table. I got into MIT, I said simply. And I received the Future Tech Innovator Scholarship, which covers most of my tuition. My mother glanced at the letter. MIT? I thought you were applying to business schools. MIT has an excellent business and technology program, I explained. I'll be focusing on their digital economics track with a concentration in telecommunications infrastructure. My father frowned. Telecommunications infrastructure? Eliza, with your name and background, you could have gotten into a proper business school, Wharton or Harvard, institutions that would prepare you for executive leadership. MIT is consistently ranked among the top programs for technology-driven business, I countered, feeling the familiar frustration rising. And their focus on digital transformation aligns with where telecommunications is heading, not where it's been. My father waved his hand dismissively. These tech-focused approaches are peripheral to the core business. Real sustainable growth comes from strategic acquisitions and market consolidation, something Marcus understands inherently. I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that digital infrastructure was transforming every aspect of telecommunications, that the very stability he prized was being disrupted by innovations he dismissed. It was a conversation we'd had before, and it always ended the same way, with my perspectives labeled as naive or misguided. Well, congratulations, my mother said, her tone suggesting she was fulfilling a parental obligation rather than expressing genuine pride. At least the scholarship will make it affordable. It wasn't the reaction I had hoped for, but it was the one I had expected. By this point, I had learned to seek validation from my achievements themselves rather than from my parents' recognition of them. The real gut punch came 3 months before I was set to leave for MIT. The entire family was gathered for Sunday dinner, a Blackwell tradition that had become increasingly tense as I grew older, and the divide between Marcus's path and mine widened. "We have an announcement," my father said, tapping his glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "As you know, Marcus has completed his first year at Princeton with distinction and has secured a summer internship at Morgan Stanley through our connection with the Whitemans. To support his professional development, Catherine and I have decided to establish a trust in his name." He smiled at Marcus, who beamed back with practiced modesty. "The trust will include a 10% ownership stake in Blackwell Communications, which will be fully vested upon his graduation. This will give him both financial security and a meaningful voice in the company's future direction." The table erupted in congratulations and excited questions from our extended family. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. A 10% stake in Blackwell Communications was worth millions, and more importantly, it represented a vote of confidence, an investment in Marcus's future that dwarfed anything they had ever done for me. "What about Eliza?" Grandma Helen's voice cut through the celebratory chatter like a blade. The table fell silent as all eyes turned to my parents. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Eliza's interests clearly lie elsewhere. She's chosen a different path, and we respect that." "Different doesn't mean unworthy of support," Grandma Helen pressed, her usually gentle voice taking on a steely quality. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice overly bright. "Of course we support Eliza. We're paying for her education, aren't we?" "Half of my education," I corrected quietly. "The scholarship covers the rest." Another awkward silence followed. "Well," my father said finally, "we have something for you too, Eliza." He nodded to my mother, who left the room briefly before returning with a wrapped package. I opened it slowly, already sensing what it contained. Would not be comparable to Marcus's trust fund. Inside was a new laptop. "Since you're interested in technology, we thought this might be helpful," my mother explained with a tight smile. "It's the model recommended for computer science students. A $2,000 laptop versus a multi-million-dollar trust fund. The disparity was so absurd it bordered on comical, and I found myself fighting back inappropriate laughter. "Thank you," I managed, placing the laptop beside my plate. "I'm sure it will be useful." Later that night, alone in my room, I finally allowed the tears to fall. Not just for this latest insult, but for a lifetime of them. The persistent message that no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough to earn the recognition Marcus received simply for existing. As I sat on my bed, eyes swollen from crying, my gaze fell on the laptop they had given me. In a moment of bitter determination, I opened it and began researching investment strategies. Whatever my parents' intentions in giving me a tool, rather than an opportunity, I would use it to build something they couldn't imagine. I placed the laptop on my desk beside my grandfather's flash drive and my MIT acceptance letter. Together, they represented something my parents had never intended, a foundation for a future they couldn't envision, but that I could see with increasing clarity. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would use everything at my disposal, my technical skills, my understanding of telecommunications, my ability to spot market inefficiencies, to build something extraordinary. Not to win my parents' approval, but to render it irrelevant, to create a success so undeniable that their recognition or lack thereof would cease to matter. What I didn't realize then was that this private moment of determination would set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead me back to Blackwell Communications, not as the overlooked daughter seeking validation, but as someone with the power to transform the very institution that had defined my family's legacy and my own exclusion from it. MIT's campus was unlike anything I had experienced before. For the first time, I found myself surrounded by people who thought like me, minds that valued technological innovation, questioned established systems, and saw data patterns where others saw random numbers. The historic brick buildings and ultra-modern research facilities seemed to embody this duality of respecting foundations while constantly pushing boundaries. During orientation week, I met Professor Maya Liang, faculty advisor for the Digital Economics program. A former telecommunications executive who had pioneered mobile payment infrastructure in developing countries before joining academia, Professor Liang had a reputation for identifying students with unique potential and connecting them with resources to develop their ideas. Our initial meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes but extended to nearly 3 hours as we discussed everything from my telesavvy platform to my vision for democratizing telecommunications, infrastructure through cloud-based solutions. "You have something uncommon, Eliza," Professor Liang said as our meeting concluded. "Not just technical aptitude or business instinct. Those are plentiful at MIT. You have perspective. You understand both the established telecommunications industry and the technological forces disrupting it. That's a valuable bridge few people can build." Her words resonated deeply. What my parents had dismissed as irrelevant dabbling, Professor Liang recognized as a strategic advantage. The very characteristics that had made me an outsider in my family positioned me as someone with unique insight in this new environment. The first semester passed in a whirlwind of challenging coursework, collaborative projects, and late-night coding sessions with classmates who shared my passion for digital innovation. For the first time, I wasn't living in Marcus's shadow. I was forging my own path, surrounded by peers who valued me for my ideas rather than comparing me to someone else. I kept in regular contact with Grandma Helen, our weekly video calls becoming an anchor of familial support in my new life. She was eager to hear about my classes, my projects, and the people I was meeting, expressing genuine interest in technical details my parents had always found tedious. "Your grandfather would be fascinated by what you're building," she told me during one call. "He always said, 'The future belongs to those who see patterns before they become obvious.'" My relationship with my immediate family, however, grew increasingly distant. Calls with my parents were brief and perfunctory, focused primarily on practical matters like holiday arrangements and tuition payments. When I shared excitement about a particularly innovative project or a competitive internship opportunity, their responses were polite but detached, as if I were speaking a language. They had no interest in learning. Marcus, meanwhile, was thriving at Princeton. His Instagram showcased a picture-perfect college experience, prestigious social clubs, impressive internships secured through our father's connections, and frequent appearances at industry events, where he was introduced as the future of Blackwell Communications. Each post garnered effusive comments from our parents, their pride evident in every response. I muted his social media accounts after the first semester, not out of jealousy, but as an act of self-preservation. I was finally building confidence in my own path, and constant reminders of the approval he received so effortlessly only reopened wounds I was trying to heal. During winter break of my freshman year, I returned home to find my bedroom had been converted into a telecommunications innovation lab, essentially a showcase for Blackwell Communications' latest products and services, designed for when my father hosted industry colleagues at our home. "We assumed you wouldn't mind," my mother explained as she showed me to the guest room where I'd be staying. "You're only home for short visits now, and your father needed a dedicated space to demonstrate our new integrated communications suite for potential investors." I said nothing, swallowing the hurt of this latest evidence that I was expendable in their lives. Marcus's room, I noted, remained untouched, a preservation of his space despite his equally long absences. The holiday season highlighted the contrast in how my parents viewed their children. My parents gifted Marcus with a new luxury car to help with networking in Princeton and shares in a promising tech startup that one of my father's business associates had recommended. My gifts were practical and impersonal: a wireless headset for your coding sessions, some clothes, and a gift card to a tech retailer. The distinction wasn't in the monetary value of the gifts, but in the thought behind them. Marcus's reflected intimate knowledge of his preferences and aspirations. Mine reflected obligation without observation. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner when my father raised his glass in a toast. "To Marcus," he announced, beaming with pride, "who's not only excelling academically, but has also been selected for the Global Business Leaders Summer Program. The Blackwell legacy is in excellent hands." Glasses clinked around the table. I took a small sip of my wine, fighting to maintain a neutral expression. "And to Eliza," my mother added, almost as an afterthought, "who's doing well at MIT." The hesitation was slight, but unmistakable, a pause that revealed how little they knew or cared about my achievements. They hadn't asked about my 4.0 GPA, my selection for the competitive Digital Infrastructure Innovation Lab, or the fact that my telesavvy platform had just secured its first round of external funding from the MIT Venture Mentoring Service. I placed my glass down carefully. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I've been selected for the Telecommunications Transformation Initiative, which pairs students with industry mentors to develop disruptive solutions. Only 3 students from MIT were chosen." A brief silence fell over the table. "That's nice," my father said finally, his tone suggesting he was unsure whether this was an achievement worth acknowledging. "Will you be working with any major providers?" "It's not about established providers," I explained, fighting to keep frustration from my voice. "It's about developing systems that could fundamentally change how telecommunications infrastructure functions, making high-quality connectivity more accessible and affordable." "Well, connections are important," my mother conceded, though in established telecommunications, the relationships Marcus is building at Princeton and through his summer program are particularly valuable for long-term industry positioning. And there it was again, the implicit comparison, the subtle devaluation of my path in favor of Marcus's, the familiar pattern that had defined my childhood continuing into my adult life. "Excuse me," I said, placing my napkin beside my plate and standing. "I'm not feeling well. I think I'll lie down." I spent the remainder of the holiday break minimizing my time at the house, instead reconnecting with Grandma Helen and working on my platform improvements at local coffee shops. When it was time to return to MIT, I felt not homesickness, but relief, a sense of returning to a place where I belonged, rather than leaving one where I didn't. Back at MIT, I threw myself into my studies and entrepreneurial pursuits with renewed determination. If my family couldn't see my value, I would create success so undeniable that their recognition became irrelevant. The Telecommunications Transformation Initiative proved transformative. My mentor, Darius Jackson, was a forward-thinking investor who had built his reputation by identifying infrastructure innovations that traditional telecommunications providers had overlooked. He took a special interest in my vision for democratizing access to advanced telecommunications tools typically reserved for major corporations with massive IT budgets. The telecommunications establishment isn't just resistant to change, Darius told me during one of our mentoring sessions. It's structurally dependent on maintaining barriers to entry and artificial scarcity. That's why true disruption won't come from established providers like Blackwell Communications. It has to come from outsiders who aren't invested in preserving the status quo. Under Darius's guidance, I refined my business concept. Rather than directly competing with established telecommunications providers, I would create tools that empowered smaller businesses and underserved communities to access and optimize communications infrastructure in ways previously available only to major corporations with dedicated IT departments. "You're not just building a business," Darius said as we reviewed my updated business plan. "You're creating an alternative approach that challenges fundamental assumptions about how telecommunications services should be delivered and priced. That's both more difficult and more valuable than simply improving existing models." By the end of sophomore year, I had transformed my concept into a functioning platform called Net Democracy. The initial version focused on aggregating excess bandwidth capacity from various providers and redistributing it through intelligent routing algorithms, allowing small businesses to access enterprise-grade telecommunications services at fraction of traditional costs. What made Net Democracy unique was its transparent approach, educating users about underlying infrastructure rather than mystifying it, and charging flat subscription fees rather than the complex, multi-tiered pricing structures that created confusion and unexpected costs. The platform launched with minimal fanfare but quickly gained traction among tech-savvy small business owners frustrated with traditional telecommunications options. Every bit of revenue was reinvested into improving the platform and expanding its capabilities. I lived frugally in a small apartment shared with 2 classmates, working nights and weekends while maintaining my academic standing. Summer after sophomore year presented a dilemma. I had no desire to return home for 3 months of strained interactions and implicit comparisons. Yet I needed to conserve financial resources to continue building Net Democracy. The solution came from an unexpected source. "I'd like you to stay with me this summer," Grandma Helen proposed during one of our weekly calls. "The condo is too big for just me, and I'd welcome the company." Her invitation was perfectly timed. Not only would it provide free accommodation, but her condominium in Boston's Seaport District was just a short subway ride from MIT's campus, where I could continue using the resources of the Digital Infrastructure Lab. What I didn't fully appreciate until I moved in was how strategic Grandma Helen's invitation was. Her home wasn't just a convenient location. It was filled with documents, connections, and insights that would prove invaluable to my developing business. "Your grandfather kept everything," she explained as she showed me to his former home office. A sunlit room overlooking Boston Harbor, lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. Technical specifications, market analyses, strategic plans, the entire history of Blackwell Communications from its founding through his retirement. I spent evenings after work exploring these archives, discovering a Blackwell Communications, very different from the one my father now ran. Under my grandfather's leadership, the company had been innovative and community-focused, dedicated to expanding access to quality telecommunications, rather than maximizing profit from existing infrastructure. The contrast with my father's approach, which prioritized high-margin corporate clients and conventional expansion strategies, couldn't have been more stark. "Your father didn't build Blackwell Communications," Grandma Helen observed one evening, as I reviewed some of my grandfather's original technical specifications. He inherited it and reshaped it according to his own limited vision. He turned an innovative telecommunications pioneer into just another corporate provider focused on quarterly earnings. Why didn't Grandpa stop him? I asked. These documents show a completely different philosophy. Grandma Helen sighed. Alexander tried, but he made the mistake of fully retiring rather than maintaining an advisory role. Once Richard had complete control, he steered the company toward what he understood: conventional strategies for conventional growth. It was profitable, so the board didn't object, even though it abandoned the original mission. This revelation was both disheartening and illuminating. Blackwell Communications, the institution that had defined my family's identity and against which my own ambitions had been judged wanting, had itself deviated from its founding principles. What my father celebrated as tradition was actually a departure from my grandfather's innovative legacy. More pragmatically, these archives provided insights into the operational infrastructure of a successful telecommunications company, information that proved invaluable as I continued developing net democracy. Understanding how traditional providers structured their operations helped me identify inefficiencies that technology could address and regulatory requirements that any telecommunications platform needed to satisfy. The summer with Grandma Helen transformed my business in another crucial way. Through her social connections, many of whom were themselves retired telecommunications professionals, I gained access to a network of potential advisors, investors, and early adopters. These experienced individuals, often frustrated with how the telecommunications industry had evolved, were intrigued by my vision for more accessible, transparent services. One such connection was Eleanor Chen, a former FCC lawyer who had become disillusioned with the regulatory capture she witnessed in the telecommunications industry. After reviewing Net Democracy's transparent pricing structure and community-oriented approach, she offered to help navigate the complex regulatory landscape, expertise that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars if obtained through traditional legal channels. What you're building addresses problems I spent decades trying to solve through regulation, Eleanor explained during our first meeting. Sometimes innovation succeeds where regulation fails. By summer's end, Net Democracy had secured a small but significant round of funding from angel investors, primarily connections made through Grandma Helen's network. The platform had grown to over 20,000 users, managing more than $15 million in telecommunications services annually. Modest by industry standards, but remarkable for a business run by a 20-year-old college student. When I returned to MIT for junior year, I faced a decision familiar to many student entrepreneurs: whether to continue my education or focus full-time on my growing business. After careful consideration and discussions with Professor Liang and Darius, I chose a middle path, reducing my course load to part-time status while dedicating more hours to Net Democracy. Your education isn't just about the degree, Professor Liang advised. It's about the environment, the connections, the resources MIT provides. Stay connected to that ecosystem as you build your company. This hybrid approach proved challenging but rewarding. My academic work informed my business decisions, while my practical experience enriched my understanding of theoretical concepts. The tension between academic rigor and entrepreneurial pragmatism created a distinctive perspective that continued to differentiate Net Democracy from competitors. As Net Democracy grew, so did media interest in its founder. A profile in TechCrunch led to features in telecommunications industry publications and invitations to speak at digital infrastructure conferences. I accepted these opportunities selectively, focusing on venues that would advance Net Democracy's mission rather than my personal profile. These public appearances had an unexpected consequence. They made it impossible for my parents to remain ignorant of my success. The daughter they had, dismissed as pursuing an impractical path, was now being recognized as an innovator in the very industry they revered. Their first acknowledgement came in the form of a brief email from my father. Saw your interview in Telecommunications Quarterly. Impressive growth for such a young company. The message wasn't exactly warm, but it represented something unprecedented. Recognition of my achievements on their own terms, not in comparison to Marcus's. I responded with a polite thank you and a link to Net Democracy's latest investment presentation, maintaining professional courtesy without betraying how much their validation still affected me emotionally. As Thanksgiving approached, I debated whether to return home or remain in Boston. The prospect of facing my family, of navigating the complex emotions their belated recognition triggered, was daunting. Yet something in me needed closure, a chance to interact with them not as the overlooked daughter seeking approval, but as the successful entrepreneur I had become. "You should go," Grandma Helen encouraged when I shared my hesitation. "Not for them, but for yourself. To show yourself how far you've come." The Eliza Blackwell who returned to Seattle that November was fundamentally different from the one who had left 2 years earlier. Externally, the changes were subtle. A more confident posture, a wardrobe that balanced professionalism with individuality, a calm self-assurance that no longer sought external validation. Internally, the transformation was profound. I had built an identity based on creation rather than comparison, on contribution rather than competition. The shift was evident from the moment I arrived. My parents greeted me with uncharacteristic deference, asking detailed questions about Net Democracy and listening with apparent interest to my responses. My father in particular seemed to be re-evaluating me through the lens of professional accomplishment rather than familial expectation. "Your user acquisition strategy is impressive," he commented after I explained Net Democracy's growth metrics. "How are you handling regulatory compliance with operations across multiple states?" It was the kind of practical, respectful question he might ask a business colleague, a marked departure from the dismissive attitude he had previously shown toward my entrepreneurial efforts. I answered thoughtfully, explaining our partnership with regional specialists who ensured compliance with varying state regulations. Marcus's presence at Thanksgiving dinner highlighted just how much had changed. While still treated as the golden child, his Princeton experiences and summer internships, once the benchmark against which my MIT education and startups were unfavorably compared, now seemed conventional rather than exceptional. His path, following a well-established trajectory toward traditional success, no longer overshadowed my more innovative approach. This subtle rebalancing wasn't lost on Marcus. Always socially perceptive, he noticed the increased attention I received and responded with a mix of curiosity and competitive instinct. "Net Democracy sounds interesting," he said during dinner, his tone suggesting he was both impressed and slightly threatened by my success. "Have you thought about how you'll compete with established providers like Blackwell Communications when users need more comprehensive enterprise solutions?" The question was pointed but fair, exactly the kind of challenge I now faced regularly in investor meetings and industry panels. "We're not trying to compete directly with traditional providers," I explained. "We're expanding the market by serving clients they've historically ignored. Many of our users have never had access to enterprise-grade telecommunications services before." My father nodded thoughtfully. "Market expansion rather than market capture. That's an interesting approach." "It's actually similar to Grandpa's original strategy for Blackwell Communications," I added, glancing at Grandma Helen, who smiled slightly. "He built the company by serving communities and businesses overlooked by established providers." A momentary tension crossed my father's face, recognition perhaps that I understood the company's history in ways he hadn't expected. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. For the first time, I had contributed to the family's business discourse as a peer rather than a protégé. That evening, as I prepared to return to Boston, my father approached me in the hallway, his manner uncharacteristically hesitant. "Eliza, I've been thinking," he began, his voice carefully measured. "Blackwell Communications has been considering expanding our digital offerings for small and medium businesses. Your experience with Net Democracy could provide valuable insights. Would you be interested in consulting on the project?" paid, of course. The proposal was surprising but not shocking. Traditional telecommunications providers were increasingly recognizing the threat and opportunity represented by digital innovations. My father was simply following industry trends by seeking expertise in this area. What was shocking was that he was approaching me for that expertise, acknowledgement not just of net democracy's success, but of my personal value as an innovator. "I appreciate the offer," I replied, maintaining professional composure despite the emotional significance of the moment. "But net democracy requires my full attention right now. We're preparing for another funding round and expanding our service offerings." He nodded, disappointment evident but tempered with something new: respect. "I understand. The offer remains open if your circumstances change." As I drove back to the airport that night, I reflected on the irony of the situation. After years of seeking my parents' approval and recognition, it had finally arrived, just as I had learned to thrive without it. The validation that once seemed essential to my identity now felt like an interesting but ultimately unnecessary addition to the foundation I had built for myself. What I didn't realize then was that this subtle shift in family dynamics was merely the prelude to a much more dramatic transformation, one that would eventually bring me back to Blackwell Communications, not as a consultant or an overlooked daughter, but as something my parents had never imagined I could become. Senior year at MIT arrived with unexpected developments. Net democracy had grown beyond my initial projections, reaching over 75,000 users managing more than $120 million in telecommunications services annually. Our team had expanded to 18 full-time employees working from a modest office space in Cambridge's Kendall Square, the heart of Boston's innovation district. The company's growth attracted attention from larger players in the telecommunications space. 4 different venture capital firms approached with investment offers, each promising capital to accelerate expansion in exchange for equity and board representation. These offers presented a strategic dilemma. Accepting external investment would provide resources for faster growth, but would dilute my control over the company's direction. "This is the crossroads every founder faces," Darius advised during one of our mentoring sessions. "The question isn't just about valuation or dilution. It's about alignment. Does the investor's vision for net democracy match yours?" After careful consideration of each proposal, I declined all 4. Instead, I opted for a smaller funding round from our existing angel investors, supplemented by a strategic partnership with a progressive regional telecommunications cooperative that wanted to offer net democracy's technology to their members. This arrangement provided necessary capital while preserving my decision-making authority and commitment to net democracy's core mission of democratizing access to advanced telecommunications infrastructure. My focus on net democracy came at the expense of coursework. Though I maintained passing grades, my transcript no longer featured the perfect GPA of previous semesters. This trade-off, once unthinkable to the achievement-oriented student I had been, now seemed an obvious prioritization. Net democracy wasn't just a school project or resume builder. It was becoming a genuine market innovator with the potential to transform how smaller businesses and underserved communities access telecommunications services. As graduation approached, Professor Liang called me in for a meeting. I expected a discussion about my declining academic performance. Instead, she surprised me with an opportunity. The Digital Economics Department is launching an Entrepreneurial Innovation Fellowship, she explained. It's designed for recent graduates who are actively building promising companies at the intersection of technology and traditional industries. The fellow receives office space, access to university computing resources, and mentorship from faculty and industry partners. We'd like you to be our inaugural fellow. The offer was perfectly timed. Net democracy was at a critical growth stage where continued connection to MIT's resources would be invaluable, particularly as we developed more sophisticated network optimization, algorithms that required advanced computational capacity. The fellowship includes a stipend, Professor Liang continued, Though I suspect that's less important to you now than the institutional affiliation and research access. She was right. Net democracy was generating enough revenue to provide me with a modest salary. But the company's computational needs were outgrowing what we could affordably access in the private market. MIT's research computing infrastructure would provide capabilities we couldn't otherwise obtain without significant additional investment. There's one more aspect that might interest you, Professor Liang added with a slight smile. Fellows are invited to give guest lectures in the digital economics program. Your journey from student to founder would be particularly valuable for current students to hear. I accepted the fellowship, recognizing it as both practical support for net democracy and an opportunity to help other young entrepreneurs navigate the challenges I had faced. The position also provided something less tangible, but equally important: institutional legitimacy. Being affiliated with MIT as a fellow, rather than just an alumna, added credibility in meetings with potential partners in telecommunications, regulators. The summer after graduation brought another significant change. Grandma Helen, now 78, decided to sell her Boston condominium and move to a retirement community in Vermont. "The winters are getting harder on these old bones," she explained during one of our weekly dinners. "And I found a wonderful community near Lake Champlain with other retired professionals. Plenty of former telecommunications pioneers to argue with about digital transformation." Though I understood her decision, the news hit hard. Grandma Helen had been my most consistent supporter, and our proximity in Boston had provided both emotional sustenance and practical assistance as I built net democracy. "I'm selling the condo," she continued, "but I want you to have something from it first." She handed me a legal document, the deed to my grandfather's home office furniture, including his modernist desk, ergonomic chair, and the filing cabinets that had contained so much of Blackwell Communications' early history. "Alexander always said, 'Your environment shapes how you think,'" she explained. He designed that office to balance functionality and inspiration, practical needs with space for creative thinking. It seems fitting that it should continue supporting a Blackwell who understands that balance. The gift was profoundly meaningful. Beyond its practical value, high-quality furniture I couldn't have afforded to purchase, it represented connection to my grandfather's legacy and Grandma Helen's ongoing faith in my path. With the proceeds from my share of the fellowship stipend and net democracy's increasing stability, I leased a small but elegant apartment in Cambridge, transforming the second bedroom into an office featuring my grandfather's furniture. The space became my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of bridging traditional telecommunications and technological innovation. Fall brought an unexpected communication, an invitation to Marcus's engagement party. After graduating from Princeton, he had accepted a full-time position at Blackwell Communications as Director of Corporate Strategy while dating Sophia Wellington, daughter of a prominent telecommunications regulatory commissioner with deep ties to Washington policy circles. The invitation indicated the event would be held at the Blackwell estate, with my parents hosting what promised to be an elaborate celebration of the impending merger between our family's telecommunications company and influential regulatory connections. The formal card was accompanied by a handwritten note from my mother. "Eliza, we hope you can attend. Your brother would appreciate your presence, and we'd love to hear more about how your company is progressing." The note's tone, polite but distant, reflected our family's ongoing evolution. My parents had progressed from dismissing my path to acknowledging it, but true understanding or enthusiasm remained elusive. Their world still revolved around traditional markers of success, prestigious institutions, established career trajectories, and strategic social connections. Net democracy's innovative approach to telecommunications infrastructure remained foreign territory, acknowledged but not fully comprehended. I debated whether to attend. The engagement party would inevitably emphasize everything I had rejected: the cultivation of insider connections, the perpetuation of telecommunications inequality, the fusion of corporate and regulatory power to maintain established market structures. Yet declining would further distance me from my family during what was genuinely a significant moment in my brother's life. After consultation with Grandma Helen, who encouraged maintaining family connections despite past hurts, I decided to attend. I would go not seeking approval or validation, but as an independent adult maintaining appropriate family ties while staying true to my own values. The engagement party was exactly what I had expected. A carefully orchestrated display of industry, influence, and social connection. The Blackwell Estate's expansive grounds were transformed with imported flowers, catering from Seattle's finest restaurants, and a string quartet playing classical selections. Guests included executives from major telecommunications companies, regulatory officials with influence over telecommunications policy, and social elites whose family names appeared on buildings throughout the Pacific Northwest. I arrived early, hoping to have a moment with my family before the crush of guests. My parents greeted me with the same careful politeness they had shown at Thanksgiving, inquiring about my work and living situation with detached interest. Marcus, resplendent, in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, seemed genuinely pleased to see me. Despite our different paths, we had never been directly hostile to each other. The favoritism that had shaped our relationship was our parents' creation, not his. "Eliza, I'm so glad you came," he said, embracing me with what felt like sincere warmth. "I want you to meet Sophia. I've told her all about your tech success." Sophia Wellington matched every expectation for a regulatory commissioner's daughter. Georgetown law, perfectly poised demeanor, and the practiced charm of someone groomed for Washington influence from birth. To her credit, she showed genuine interest in net democracy, asking informed questions about our approach to digital equity and rural access. "The industry needs these innovations," she acknowledged, surprising me with her candor. "Traditional providers like Blackwell are excellent at serving corporate clients, but less adept at reaching underserved communities. Companies like yours are expanding the entire ecosystem." As more guests arrived, I circulated through the party, reconnecting with extended family members and meeting my parents' industry connections. The reactions to my introduction as the founder of Net Democracy ranged from polite confusion to genuine curiosity, with several guests requesting my contact information for follow-up conversations. The evening's pivotal moment came during my father's formal toast to the engaged couple. Standing on the mansion's terrace overlooking Puget Sound, he raised his champagne flute with practiced elegance. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Marcus and Sophia, but the joining of two families dedicated to excellence in telecommunications," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. The Blackwell and Wellington names represent the ideal partnership between industry innovation and thoughtful regulation, guiding telecommunications evolution with equal dedication to stakeholder value and public interest. He continued with a brief history of both families' contributions to the telecommunications industry, emphasizing tradition, stability, and continuity, with Marcus advancing through the leadership ranks at Blackwell Communications and Sophia continuing her family's public service legacy. We can be confident that the values and expertise our families represent will continue shaping the telecommunications landscape for generations to come. The speech was perfectly crafted for the audience, celebrating exactly the qualities they most valued. The guests nodded appreciatively, seeing in Marcus and Sophia the ideal continuation of the established order. What struck me most, however, wasn't what my father said, but what remained unspoken. There was no mention of digital transformation or network democratization. No acknowledgement of the access disparities plaguing communities outside the wealthy urban centers. No recognition that the telecommunications industry was experiencing fundamental disruption. His vision of the future was simply a continuation of the past, with new names carrying forward the same approaches. As applause followed the toast, my father made an announcement that sent ripples through the gathering. In celebration of this momentous occasion, Catherine and I are delighted to share another piece of news, he continued, gesturing for my mother to join him. We have established a transition fund of $1 million for Marcus, ensuring his leadership path at Blackwell. Communications will be fully supported. Additionally, we're accelerating the timetable for Marcus's trust, making his 10% stake in Blackwell Communications available immediately rather than waiting until the previously established milestone. The crowd responded with appropriate appreciation, several guests commenting on the generosity of the gift. I maintained a neutral expression, sipping champagne that suddenly tasted bitter. It wasn't the monetary value that stung. Net Democracy's valuation now made me financially independent, but the persistent pattern. Once again, my parents were investing their resources and public approval in Marcus's conventional path, while my unconventional one received acknowledgement without comparable support. Later in the evening, I found myself alone on a secluded portion of the terrace, taking a moment away from the persistent networking that such events entailed. My father approached, 2 glasses of scotch in hand, offering one to me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Quite the celebration," I commented, accepting the drink with a polite nod. "The Wellingtons have been valued allies for 2 generations," he replied. "This union strengthens important industry relationships." His framing was revealing, viewing even his son's marriage partially through the lens of business advantage. I wondered if my own achievements were similarly evaluated based on their potential benefit to the Blackwell name rather than their inherent value. "That was quite a transition gift," I said, keeping my tone neutral. $1 million would fund a significant expansion for most startups. My father had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Marcus's path has always aligned with the family's interests," he said after a moment. "His success directly benefits Blackwell Communications. Your venture, while impressive, operates in a different sphere." "Different doesn't mean disconnected," I countered. The technologies we're developing at Net Democracy could significantly enhance Blackwell's capabilities, particularly in reaching smaller businesses and underserved communities. He took a thoughtful sip of scotch. "Perhaps, but disruption carries risk. Blackwell Communications has thrived for 3 generations by maintaining proven approaches. Stability is our primary selling point to enterprise clients." "Stability becomes stagnation if it prevents adaptation," I said, voicing a perspective I had long held but rarely shared directly with my father. The telecommunications landscape is changing fundamentally. Traditional providers that don't evolve risk becoming irrelevant. My father's expression hardened slightly. Blackwell Communications has weathered every market cycle and regulatory shift for nearly 60 years. I appreciate your enthusiasm for new approaches, Eliza, but there's value in systems proven by time. The conversation revealed the fundamental disconnect that had always separated us. Where I saw opportunity and change, he perceived threat. Where I valued innovation, he prioritized continuation. We were looking at the same industry through fundamentally different lenses. As I prepared to leave the engagement party, my mother pulled me aside for an awkward but seemingly sincere conversation. "Eliza, I know we haven't always understood your choices," she began, choosing her words carefully. "But we are proud of what you're accomplishing, different as it may be from the traditional Blackwell path." The acknowledgement, however belated and qualified, represented progress from the dismissal of my earlier years. I thanked her with genuine appreciation for the sentiment while recognizing its limitations. My parents were trying, in their way, to bridge the gap their own actions had created, but true understanding remained elusive. "Will you be attending the wedding?" she asked. "It's planned for June at the Wellington Estate in Virginia, a full weekend of events." "I'll try," I promised, knowing that Net Democracy's growth trajectory might make such a time commitment challenging. "Send me the dates when they're confirmed." Returning to Cambridge after the engagement party, I found myself reflecting on the stark contrast between my family's world and the one I was building. The Blackwell Wellington celebration epitomized an approach to telecommunications built on exclusivity, established connections, and intergenerational power transfer. Net democracy represented the opposite: democratization, algorithmic efficiency, and merit-based opportunity. This contrast crystallized my vision for net democracy's next phase of development. We would expand beyond infrastructure optimization into areas traditionally dominated by firms like Blackwell Communications, Enterprise, Solutions, Integrated Communication Services, and specialized vertical applications. But unlike traditional providers that reserved these capabilities for large corporate clients, we would make them accessible to smaller organizations through technological efficiency and innovative subscription models. The following Monday, I called an all-hands meeting at Net Democracy's office, sharing this expanded vision with our growing team. The response was enthusiastic, with engineers immediately proposing approaches to scale enterprise-level telecommunications capabilities. Through our cloud platform, this isn't just about building new features, I explained as the discussion progressed. It's about challenging fundamental assumptions about who deserves access to advanced telecommunications services. The capabilities that firms like Blackwell Communications reserve for Fortune 500 companies should be available to local businesses, nonprofits, and educational institutions. The team embraced this mission with renewed energy. Over the next 3 months, we developed and launched Net Democracy Enterprise, a comprehensive telecommunications suite that used cloud infrastructure to provide small and medium businesses, with the communications capabilities typically available only to large corporations with extensive IT departments. The product launch exceeded our most optimistic projections. User growth accelerated dramatically, with total services managed passing $250 million by year-end. Industry publications took notice, with Digital Infrastructure Quarterly naming Net Democracy Most Disruptive Telecommunications Platform and featuring me on their 30 Under 30 list of telecommunications innovators. This public recognition inevitably reached my parents' attention. My father sent a brief email congratulating me on the award, adding that several enterprise clients have mentioned your platform recently. The message wasn't effusive, but it represented acknowledgement that Net Democracy had grown beyond a student project to become a recognized industry player. Marcus's wedding arrived the following June, a multi-day extravaganza in Virginia featuring everything money and influence could buy, from political celebrities to custom telecommunications, themed cocktails. The event was covered in both Society, Pages, and industry publications, celebrating the union of two prominent telecommunications families. I attended the main ceremony and reception, but skipped most peripheral events, citing unavoidable work commitments. This was partially true. Net Democracy was preparing for another major product launch, but also a necessary boundary. Spending 4 days immersed in exactly the world I was working to transform wasn't conducive to maintaining my focus and perspective. The wedding itself was a spectacle of wealth and connection. My parents beamed with pride throughout the event, clearly viewing Marcus's marriage as the perfect continuation of the Blackwell legacy. The $1 million transition fund had evidently been treated as a minimum rather than a limit, with estimates in industry publications placing the total wedding cost closer to $2 million. During the reception, I found myself seated at a table with several telecommunications industry veterans, including Victoria Sanchez, a senior partner at one of the largest telecommunications investment firms in the country. To my surprise, she was familiar with Net Democracy's work. "Your perspective on cloud-based infrastructure democratization is quite interesting," she commented after introducing herself. "I've had our innovation team studying your approach. The scalability is remarkable for handling enterprise-level needs without enterprise-level costs." The conversation that followed was one of the most intellectually engaging of the entire wedding weekend. Victoria asked incisive questions about Net Democracy's technology, business model, and regulatory approach. Unlike many traditional telecommunications executives, She seemed genuinely interested in understanding innovation rather than dismissing it. The industry is changing faster than most established players are willing to admit, she observed as our discussion concluded. Firms that adapt will thrive. Those that resist will become obsolete regardless of their historical prominence. If you're ever interested in discussing strategic partnerships, my door is open. Her perspective was refreshingly aligned with my own assessment of the telecommunications landscape. As I left the wedding that evening, I reflected on the irony that I had found more meaningful professional connection with a stranger at my brother's wedding than I had ever experienced with my own father, despite our shared industry. Returning to Cambridge, I channeled my energy into net democracy's continued expansion. The MIT Fellowship provided access to computational resources that enabled us to develop increasingly sophisticated network optimization tools. Our user base continued growing, with particular traction among mid-sized organizations disillusioned with traditional telecommunications providers. Then came the news that would ultimately transform my relationship with Blackwell Communications. The company was exploring a potential acquisition by Global Communications Network, a major telecommunications conglomerate known for absorbing regional providers and standardizing their operations to maximize efficiency and profitability. The information reached me through Grandma Helen, who maintained connections with several former executives at Blackwell Communications. Richard believes this is the optimal path forward, she explained during one of our weekly phone calls. Global Communications is offering a substantial premium over market valuation, and he sees it as securing the company's future in an increasingly competitive landscape. The news was surprising but not shocking. My father's approach to business had always prioritized stability and predictability. Selling to a larger institution represented a logical extension of that philosophy, sacrificing independence for security. What happens to the Blackwell name if the acquisition goes through? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Eventually, it disappears, Grandma Helen confirmed. Global Communications typically maintains acquired brands for 2 to 3 years before full integration. After that, Blackwell Communications would exist only in corporate archives. The thought of my grandfather's creation being absorbed and ultimately erased struck me as profoundly sad. Blackwell Communications had begun as an innovative response to unmet market needs. Not unlike net democracy itself, that legacy deserved better than corporate assimilation. When is the board voting on the acquisition? I asked, an idea beginning to form in my mind. Next quarter, Grandma Helen replied. Richard is confident it will pass, but several board members have expressed reservations about Global Communications' approach to local markets. They're known for centralizing operations and eliminating regional autonomy. The conversation planted a seed that would grow into the most audacious plan of my career, preventing Blackwell Communications' acquisition by offering an alternative vision for its future, one that honored its innovative origins while embracing technological transformation. The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Net democracy was successful but still a fraction of Blackwell Communications' size. Creating a viable counteroffer would require resources far beyond what we currently controlled. Yet the more I considered the possibility, the more convinced I became of its potential. Net democracy's technological infrastructure combined with Blackwell Communications' established client base and regulatory standing could create something more valuable than either company independently, a firm that bridged traditional telecommunications and technological innovation, enterprise service, and accessibility. The path forward would require perfect execution across multiple dimensions, securing necessary financing, developing a compelling business case for the board, navigating complex regulatory requirements, and addressing inevitable family complications. The odds were heavily against success. But as I sat at my grandfather's desk in my Cambridge apartment, reviewing Blackwell Communications' publicly available financial information, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that transcended ordinary business ambition. this wasn't just about building something new. It was about preserving something valuable while transforming it for the future. With that determination, I began developing what would become known within telecommunications circles as the most audacious infrastructure acquisition attempt of the decade, a quest that would either revolutionize the family legacy or become an expensive lesson in overreach. What I couldn't have anticipated was how this professional challenge would ultimately force a reckoning with the family dynamics that had shaped my identity from childhood, and how the business strategy I was developing would become inextricably linked with my personal journey toward reconciliation and self-definition. The plan to acquire Blackwell Communications required resources far beyond what Net Democracy could generate independently. My first step was securing the necessary capital through a strategic funding round. Rather than approaching traditional venture capital firms that might prioritize quick returns over long-term vision, I focused on mission-aligned investors who understood the transformative potential of combining Net Democracy's technology with Blackwell Communications' established infrastructure. My primary target was the Digital Transformation Fund, led by Naomi Chen, a former telecommunications executive who had left traditional providers to support disruptive technologies. Naomi had previously expressed interest in Net Democracy, but had considered us too early stage for her fund's investment criteria. The potential Blackwell acquisition changed that calculation significantly. I prepared a comprehensive presentation outlining the strategic rationale. Blackwell Communications provided regulatory clearances, enterprise client relationships, and operational infrastructure that would otherwise take Net Democracy years to develop independently. Net Democracy contributed technological capabilities, a younger demographic of users, and innovative service models that Blackwell Communications had failed to develop under my father's leadership. This isn't just a business combination, I explained. During my presentation to the Digital Transformation Investment Committee, it's a bridge between traditional and digital approaches to telecommunications, combining established expertise with technological innovation to create something neither company could achieve independently. Naomi's response was measured, but encouraging. The strategic logic is compelling, but the execution complexity is substantial. You're proposing that a company with $300 million in assets under management acquire one controlling over $3 billion. The regulatory hurdles alone would be formidable. That's precisely why we need the right partners, I acknowledged. This acquisition requires patient capital from investors who understand both traditional telecommunications and digital disruption. The Digital Transformation Fund uniquely stands at that intersection. After 3 rounds of increasingly detailed discussions, the Digital Transformation Fund committed to lead a $200 million funding round specifically structured to support the acquisition attempt. Their investment was contingent on securing additional capital from complementary sources and developing a viable regulatory strategy for the proposed combination. With the Digital Transformation Fund's commitment as validation, I approached several other potential investors, including Victoria Sanchez, the investment firm partner I had met at Marcus's wedding. Her firm, Sanchez Partners, specialized in telecommunications transformations and had been increasingly focused on technology-driven changes in the industry. "Your timing is impeccable," Victoria commented during our initial discussion. "We've been looking for opportunities to invest in the integration of traditional and digital telecommunications. This combination represents exactly the future we envision for the industry." Sanchez Partners committed $100 million to the funding round, with Victoria joining as a strategic advisor to help navigate the complex regulatory landscape the acquisition would entail. Her extensive relationships with telecommunications regulators would prove invaluable as the process advanced. The final piece of the capital structure came from an unexpected source. During a routine update call with Grandma Helen about the acquisition plans, she asked detailed questions about the investment structure and capital requirements. "You're still approximately $75 million short of what you'll need for a credible offer," she observed after reviewing the financial projections I had shared. "Have you considered approaching some of your grandfather's original clients? Many have remained with Blackwell Communications primarily out of loyalty to his vision, not necessarily alignment with your father's approach." This insight led to meetings with several enterprise clients who had been with Blackwell Communications since my grandfather's era. Many expressed frustration with the increasingly standardized services the firm had offered under my father's leadership and concern about further homogenization under global communications ownership. The Madison Group, whose telecommunications needs had been among my grandfather's first major enterprise deployments, was particularly receptive to my vision. William Madison, now in his 70s, remembered my grandfather's innovative approach with evident nostalgia. Alexander Blackwell understood that telecommunications infrastructure should adapt to clients' unique operational requirements, not force clients into standardized service packages, he recalled during our meeting at his Seattle office. That philosophy seems to have been lost at Blackwell Communications in recent years. Your approach with net democracy appears closer to your grandfather's original vision than what the firm has become. The Madison Group committed $40 million to the funding round, with several other legacy clients contributing smaller amounts that collectively provided the remaining capital needed for a viable acquisition offer. By early February, I had secured commitments for $375 million in funding, sufficient to make a credible offer for Blackwell Communications while maintaining enough operating capital to support the combined entity through the integration process. The financial structure was designed to allow Net Democracy to technically serve as the acquiring entity, despite being the smaller company, with the investors receiving preferred equity in the combined organization. The next challenge was developing a detailed integration plan addressing operational, technological, and cultural aspects of combining the two companies. This required deep understanding of Blackwell Communications' internal operations, information not publicly available, and certainly not something my father would willingly provide to a potential competing bidder. Once again, Grandma Helen proved an invaluable ally. Though no longer actively involved in Blackwell Communications governance, she maintained close relationships with several senior executives who had served since my grandfather's era. Through these connections, I obtained insights into the firm's technological infrastructure, client service models, and operational challenges. What emerged was a picture of a company trapped between eras, operating with legacy systems increasingly incapable of meeting modern client expectations, but lacking the leadership vision and technical expertise to implement meaningful transformation. Global Communications' acquisition strategy would address these issues through standardization and cost-cutting rather than innovation, effectively extracting value from the Blackwell brand before eventually discarding it. My alternative vision centered on technological revitalization while preserving the personalized client relationships that had defined Blackwell Communications' early success. Net Democracy's cloud infrastructure and digital interfaces would modernize operations while the combined entity maintained the high-touch service model that distinguished Blackwell Communications from larger, more impersonal competitors. With funding secured and integration strategy developed, the time had come to formally approach Blackwell Communications' board with an acquisition offer. Rather than presenting the proposal directly, which would likely trigger immediate rejection, based on my father's influence, I worked through Victoria Sanchez to arrange a confidential presentation to key board members. The presentation, scheduled for late February at Sanchez Partners' offices in downtown Seattle, represented a defining moment in my professional journey. I would be proposing not just a business transaction, but a fundamental reimagining of my family's legacy, challenging my father's stewardship while claiming connection to my grandfather's original vision. I arrived at the meeting composed but intensely focused, dressed in a conservative charcoal suit that acknowledged traditional business aesthetics while accessorizing with subtle tech-inspired touches that reflected Net Democracy's innovative identity. The boardroom contained 4 of Blackwell Communications' 11 directors, including Michael Anderson, the lead independent director, who would be instrumental in any acquisition decision. "Thank you for meeting with me today," I began, consciously using the controlled confidence I had developed through years of investor presentations. "I appreciate your willingness to consider an alternative to the global communications acquisition proposal currently before the board." I proceeded to outline Net Democracy's counteroffer, $850 million for full acquisition, representing a 12% premium over Global Communications' offer, structured as a combination of cash and equity in the combined entity. The presentation emphasized not just financial terms, but strategic vision, how the combination would position the firm for leadership in an increasingly digital telecommunications landscape, while preserving the personalized service that distinguished Blackwell Communications from mass-market competitors. "What you're proposing is technically impressive," Michael Anderson commented as I concluded the presentation, "but fundamentally changes Blackwell Communications' identity. How do you address the concern that existing enterprise clients might see this as abandonment of the firm's traditional values?" "By reconnecting with the firm's original values," I replied. "Blackwell Communications wasn't founded as a traditionalist institution. My grandfather built it by recognizing unmet needs and developing innovative approaches to address them. What I'm proposing isn't abandonment of the firm's heritage, but reconnection with its foundational entrepreneurial spirit." The questions that followed were rigorous but fair, focusing on regulatory feasibility, client retention strategies, and operational integration plans. I had anticipated each concern and provided detailed, thoughtful responses that demonstrated both technical competence and strategic vision. As the meeting concluded, Michael Anderson's expression revealed nothing about the board's likely decision. "We'll need to discuss this proposal in comparison to the Global Communications offer," he said simply. "You've given us a viable alternative to consider. We'll be in touch through Ms. Sanchez once we've had time for proper evaluation." The waiting period that followed was excruciating. Though Victoria provided occasional updates on the board's deliberations, the final decision remained uncertain. The directors were divided, with some favoring the security of Global Communications' established integration process, while others were intrigued by Net Democracy's more innovative vision. The balance appeared to be shifting toward Global Communications when an unexpected development changed the equation. A major Blackwell Communications client, Western Healthcare Systems, a hospital network with over 5,000 locations using Blackwell's telecommunications infrastructure, announced it would reconsider its contract if the Global Communications acquisition proceeded. "We selected Blackwell Communications for its regional expertise and customized approach," Western Healthcare's CIO explained in a letter to the board that quickly leaked to industry media. "Global Communications' standardized services don't align with our specialized needs. We would maintain our relationship if the firm remained independently operated or partnered with an entity committed to personalized service innovation." This public statement triggered similar concerns from other significant clients, creating pressure on the board to reconsider the Global Communications proposal. Victoria informed me that my acquisition offer was receiving renewed attention, with particular focus on client retention projections under different ownership scenarios. 2 weeks after Western Healthcare's announcement, I received a call from Michael Anderson requesting a second presentation to the full board, including my father as CEO. Unlike the previous confidential meeting, this would be a formal evaluation of competing acquisition proposals, with both Global Communications and Net Democracy presenting their respective visions for Blackwell Communications' future. The meeting was scheduled for March 15th at Blackwell Communications headquarters in downtown Seattle, my first return to the building since a childhood "take your daughter to work" day that had ended with my father suggesting I might be better suited to creative pursuits than telecommunications leadership. The irony was not lost on me as I prepared for a presentation that would directly challenge his leadership vision. I arrived 20 minutes early, using the time to center myself in a nearby coffee shop rather than waiting awkwardly in the Blackwell Communications lobby. The building itself was a physical manifestation of my father's conservative approach, a glass and steel structure with traditional furnishings that projected stability at the expense of innovation. At precisely 2 p.m., I entered the Blackwell Communications boardroom to find all 11 directors seated around a massive conference table. My father occupied the chair at the head, his expression a carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality despite the obvious personal significance of the situation. Global Communications presented first, with their corporate development team outlining an acquisition strategy focusing on operational efficiency, standardized service models, and cost reduction through elimination of redundant functions. Their presentation was polished and data-driven, emphasizing financial metrics and shareholder returns rather than client impact or innovation potential. When my turn came, I approached the presentation not as a daughter challenging her father, but as a telecommunications innovator proposing a better future for an important institution. My presentation acknowledged Blackwell Communications' strengths while directly addressing its technological limitations and the changing expectations of clients across generations. The choice before this board isn't between tradition and innovation, I concluded after detailing the technical and operational aspects of the proposed combination. It's between decline disguised as stability and growth rooted in adaptability. Net democracy doesn't seek to erase what Blackwell Communications has built, but to evolve it for a future where telecommunications services will be unrecognizable to those clinging to outdated models. Throughout the presentation, my father maintained rigid composure, betraying no reaction to proposals that essentially declared his leadership approach obsolete. Only when Michael Anderson opened the floor for questions did the personal dimension of the situation emerge. "Ms. Blackwell," my father began, his use of the formal address highlighting the professional rather than familial context. "Your proposal suggests fundamental changes to Blackwell Communications' client service model. What evidence suggests our enterprise clients want these changes rather than the consistency they've historically valued?" "Client retention data, demographic analysis, and direct feedback," I replied, matching his professional tone. "Blackwell Communications has experienced 15% client attrition among technology-focused enterprises in the past 2 years, primarily to more digitally advanced providers. Meanwhile, Net Democracy has achieved 94% retention while growing primarily through client referrals. The evidence indicates that consistency without adaptation is increasingly viewed as stagnation." The exchange continued with increasingly pointed questions about regulatory risks, technology integration timelines, and cultural compatibility between the organizations. Throughout, I maintained focus on strategic rationale rather than personal dynamics, refusing to be drawn into the family conflict simmering beneath the business discussion. As the meeting concluded, Michael Anderson thanked both parties and announced that the board would deliberate privately before making their decision. "We expect to reach a determination within 2 weeks," he stated. Both proposals present viable futures for Blackwell Communications, though with significantly different visions. Our responsibility is determining which best serves our clients, employees, and shareholders. I left the boardroom without making eye contact with my father, knowing that personal conversation would be inappropriate in that context and likely unproductive. In any case, his vision for Blackwell Communications reflected his genuine beliefs about telecommunications services, just as mine reflected my different perspective. Our business disagreement was as real as our personal disconnect. The 2 weeks waiting period extended into 3 as the board requested additional information from both bidders. A family dinner scheduled during this time created a particularly awkward dynamic. I had agreed to attend a small gathering at my parents' home, primarily to visit with Grandma Helen, who had traveled from Vermont for a medical checkup. The dinner conversation carefully avoided the acquisition topic, focusing instead on neutrally safe subjects like Grandma Helen's retirement community and Marcus's honeymoon plans. The strain was evident nonetheless, with my father maintaining professional courtesy while avoiding substantive interaction. As I helped my mother clear dishes after the meal, she broached the subject obliquely. "Your father hasn't been sleeping well," she observed, her tone suggesting I should interpret this as evidence of personal distress rather than business concern. "The acquisition decision is significant for everyone involved," I replied, neutrally, acknowledging the situation without accepting implicit blame for it. "He built Blackwell Communications into what it is today," she continued. 30 years of his life dedicated to the company's growth." "I understand that," I said carefully. "The proposal isn't a rejection of what he's built, but an evolution of it, one that I believe better positions the company for future success." My mother glanced toward the dining room where my father was discussing something with Grandma Helen, her expression complex. "He sees it as a repudiation," she said quietly. "Whether you intended it that way or not." This perspective provided useful context for understanding the emotional undercurrents of the board's potential decision. My father would likely view acceptance of Net Democracy's proposal as personal rejection rather than business evolution. This realization led me to add a crucial element to the offer, a structured leadership transition that would allow my father to remain as chairman for 3 years, focusing on client relationships and brand continuity, while I led technological integration as CEO. I communicated this modification to Michael Anderson via email the following Monday, emphasizing that it reflected practical recognition of my father's client relationships rather than a concession to family dynamics. "The board will make their decision based on business merit," I wrote, "but acknowledgement of transition sensitivities might make implementation more successful if Net Democracy's proposal were selected." On April 5th, exactly 7 weeks after my formal presentation, Victoria Sanchez called with news that the Blackwell Communications Board had reached a decision. They had voted 6-5 in favor of Net Democracy's acquisition proposal, with Michael Anderson casting the deciding vote after extensive consultation with major clients. "Congratulations," Victoria said, her tone balancing professional decorum with genuine warmth. "You've just executed one of the most audacious telecommunications infrastructure acquisitions in recent memory. The board was particularly impressed with your modified leadership transition proposal, which they felt demonstrated maturity and strategic thinking beyond the technical aspects of the combination." The formal announcement would come the following morning, with both companies issuing coordinated press releases emphasizing continuity for clients alongside technological enhancement. The transaction would formally close after regulatory approval, likely in approximately 6 months. "Has my father been informed?" I asked, the personal dimension suddenly reasserting itself now that the business decision was finalized. "Michael Anderson called him immediately after the vote," Victoria confirmed. "I don't have details of that conversation, but the press release includes a quote from him supporting the combination as an evolution that honors Blackwell Communications' heritage while embracing necessary innovation." The carefully crafted statement sounded nothing like my father's natural voice, suggesting the public relations teams had already taken control of the narrative. What mattered wasn't the polished quote, but how he genuinely felt about a decision that fundamentally challenged his leadership legacy. I found out the next morning when my father called, the first direct communication we'd had since the board presentation. "The board has made their decision," he began without preamble, his voice controlled but with underlying tension evident. "I've instructed the executive team to cooperate fully with transition planning. Whatever our personal differences, Blackwell Communications deserves a successful future." "Thank you," I replied, matching his professional tone while searching for words that might bridge the personal gulf without denying the reality of our different visions. "The leadership transition structure is sincere. Your client relationships and institutional knowledge are valuable assets for the combined organization." A pause followed, heavy with unspoken history. "You presented a compelling vision," he finally said, the admission clearly difficult. "Different from what I would have chosen, but apparently aligned with where the market is moving. The board made a rational decision. This acknowledgement, however grudging, represented significant evolution from the father who had dismissed my business ideas throughout my youth. Professional recognition, if not personal reconciliation, was emerging from the acquisition process. "I'd like to meet to discuss transition planning," I offered, maintaining the professional framing that seemed to enable our communication. "There are aspects of Blackwell Communications operations where your perspective would be particularly valuable." "I'll have my assistant schedule something," he agreed before ending the call with businesslike efficiency. The public announcement generated significant attention in telecommunications media, with headlines emphasizing the unusual dynamics of a smaller, newer company acquiring a long-standing institution. TechCrunch ran a feature titled "The Blackwell Revolution: How a Digital Innovator Disrupted Her Own Family Legacy," focusing on the personal narrative behind the business transaction. I declined most interview requests, providing only brief statements emphasizing the strategic rationale for the combination rather than the family dynamics that made it newsworthy. The acquisition was significant, regardless of the personal elements, representing a new model for integrating traditional telecommunications with digital innovation. The 6 months between announcement and closing were filled with intensive planning. Integration teams from both companies worked to map technology, systems, client service models, and organizational structures. Regulatory filings required exhaustive documentation of how the combined entity would maintain compliance while implementing new approaches to telecommunications services. Throughout this period, my father maintained professional cooperation while keeping personal interaction minimal. We met weekly to discuss transition issues, with conversations focused exclusively on business matters, client retention strategies, regulatory considerations, and team restructuring. These discussions were substantive and occasionally even productive, as his experience complemented my innovative perspective in addressing complex operational challenges. The closing date was set for October 15th, almost exactly a year after I had first learned about the potential global communications acquisition. The timing created a symbolic bookend to a year that had transformed both my professional trajectory and family relationships. The day before closing, I received an unexpected call from my mother, who had remained largely in the background throughout the acquisition process. "I'd like to have dinner with you tonight," she said, her voice carrying an unusual combination of hesitation and determination. "Just the two of us. There are things I think we should discuss before tomorrow makes everything official." We met at a small restaurant in Seattle, away from the financial district where we might encounter Blackwell Communications employees or family connections. My mother arrived precisely on time, dressed with her usual elegant restraint, though I noticed subtle signs of stress in her expression and posture. "This past year has been illuminating," she began after we had ordered. "Watching you create something so significant while simultaneously challenging Richard's vision for Blackwell Communications has forced me to reconsider many of my assumptions." I remained silent, allowing her to continue without interruption. "I failed you, Eliza," she said directly, meeting my eyes with unusual intensity. "Not just in small ways, but fundamentally. I accepted and reinforced a family dynamic that valued Marcus's conventional achievements while dismissing your different but equally valid path. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology, unexpected and seemingly sincere, momentarily left me speechless. Throughout my childhood and early adulthood, my mother had been a secondary force in the family's favoritism, less actively dismissive than my father, but consistently reinforcing the pattern through her choices and attention. "What changed your perspective?" I finally asked, genuinely curious about the evolution her words suggested. "Many things cumulatively," she replied, considering the question seriously. "Seeing how differently Helen evaluated your potential was the first crack in my certainty. Then watching you build net democracy into something substantial despite our lack of support. The board's decision to accept your vision over global communications was particularly significant. objective validation from telecommunications experts that your approach had genuine merit. She paused, seeming to search for the right words. But the most powerful realization came from reflecting on how differently your father and I supported you and Marcus. The $1 million transition fund compared to a laptop for you. The trust fund acceleration for him versus the conversion of your bedroom to a product demonstration space. When I finally saw these patterns clearly, I couldn't defend them even to myself. The closing day arrived with ceremonial formality. The Blackwell Communications boardroom, with its imposing conference table and wall of telecommunications innovation awards, hosted the signing ceremony, attended by key executives from both companies, legal representatives, and major investors. My father sat at one end of the table in his customary position, while I occupied a seat near the middle, deliberately avoiding the appearance of immediately claiming leadership territory. Michael Anderson called the gathering to order with practiced authority. Today marks a significant transition in Blackwell Communications history, he began. After nearly 60 years as an independently operated firm, we begin a new chapter. As part of a combined organization that honors our heritage while embracing digital transformation, the legal process proceeded methodically, signatures on dozens of documents transferring ownership, establishing the new governance structure, and formalizing leadership responsibilities. I signed each with deliberate attention, acutely aware of the historical significance not just for the companies involved, but for my personal journey. When the final document was executed, Michael Anderson invited my father to make remarks as the outgoing CEO. He rose with the polished dignity that had always characterized his professional persona, adjusting his custom cufflinks before addressing the room. Blackwell Communications was founded by my father to provide innovative telecommunications solutions to clients overlooked by established providers. He began, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of the moment. For nearly 3 decades, I've attempted to honor that mission while adapting to changing market conditions. The telecommunications landscape continues evolving, requiring new approaches and technologies beyond my particular expertise. He paused, glancing briefly in my direction before continuing. Eliza brings a vision for telecommunications services that leverages digital technology to expand access without sacrificing personalization. Our board has determined this represents the most viable future for Blackwell Communications. As chairman, during this transition period, I commit to supporting this evolution while ensuring we maintain the client-focused values that have defined our firm since its founding. The statement was more gracious than I had expected, acknowledging both the legitimacy of my vision and his commitment to a successful transition, whether motivated by professional responsibility, personal growth, or simply pragmatic acceptance of reality. His words established a constructive foundation for our working relationship during the integration process. When invited to speak as the incoming CEO, I focused on operational continuity and strategic evolution rather than personal dynamics. His recognition that they could be complementary rather than competitive marked genuine intellectual growth, a willingness to reconsider deeply held assumptions in response to compelling evidence. I've been reflecting on my response to your early interest in technology, he said after a pause, surprising me with this shift toward personal territory. I interpreted your different interests as rejection of the Blackwell legacy rather than potential evolution of it. That was short-sighted. The admission hung in the air between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of error that went beyond business strategy to touch our personal relationship. I considered my response carefully, wanting to neither minimize past hurts nor block potential reconciliation. I always saw digital innovation as extension rather than rejection, I replied. Grandpa built Blackwell Communications by recognizing unmet needs and developing creative approaches to address them. Net democracy represents the same fundamental impulse, just expressed through different mechanisms appropriate to current market conditions. Helen made a similar observation, he noted with a small smile. She suggested I've spent my career trying to preserve my father's creation, while you focused on continuing his innovation. There's wisdom in that distinction I failed to appreciate until recently. The conversation continued through dinner, gradually transitioning from business philosophy to more personal matters. For the first time in my adult life, my father asked genuine questions about my experiences at MIT, my early entrepreneurial efforts, and the challenges I had overcome building net democracy without traditional institutional support. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he acknowledged as we finished our meal. "Building a successful digital telecommunications company without the advantages typically considered essential in this industry. Established connections, institutional backing, extensive capital resources. That required not just intelligence but extraordinary determination." "I had help," I noted, thinking particularly of Grandma Helen's support and Professor Liang's mentorship. "Different from traditional advantages, but valuable nonetheless." "Yes, but the central vision and execution were yours," he insisted. "I may have disagreed with your approach, but I can't deny the results you've achieved or the impressive organization you've built. That deserves recognition regardless of our past differences." This explicit acknowledgement of my achievements, offered without qualification or comparison to Marcus, represented something I had unconsciously sought throughout my childhood and early adulthood. The validation was meaningful, despite having built an identity no longer dependent on his approval. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my father mentioned that he had been thinking about the imbalance between the support Marcus had received and what had been offered to me. "The disparity wasn't just unfair, it was poor leadership," he said. "Recognizing only one type of potential while dismissing others creates organizational blind spots. I made that mistake as a parent before repeating it as a CEO." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I can't change the past, but I've been considering ways to address the institutional aspect of that imbalance." The following week, my father presented a proposal to the board of directors, establishing a digital innovation fund within Blackwell Digital Communications, with $5 million in initial funding dedicated to developing telecommunications solutions, specifically serving underserved communities and non-traditional users. The proposal included appointing me as the fund's executive chair, while he would serve as an advisor, a reversal of our roles in the larger organization. The board approved the proposal unanimously, recognizing both its business value and symbolic significance for the combined organization's culture. The Digital Innovation Fund represented my father's most sophisticated understanding yet of both the digital vision I had championed and the personal reconciliation we were navigating. Rather than offering direct financial compensation for past imbalance, which would have maintained the transactional framing of our relationship, he proposed institutional commitment to values we now shared, expanding telecommunications access to underserved communities through innovative approaches. "The fund aligns perfectly with our strategic direction," I agreed when he presented the approved proposal. "And, personally, the focus on expanding access makes it particularly meaningful." "That's what I thought," he replied with a small smile. "A way of honoring both Alexander's legacy and your vision simultaneously." This moment epitomized the transformation in our family dynamics, from competitive comparison to collaborative contribution, from rigid hierarchy to mutual respect. The journey hadn't erased the hurts of the past or completely resolved all tensions, but it had created a framework for healthier relationship moving forward. As integration between the organizations progressed, something unexpected emerged. A genuine synthesis rather than mere combination of the two companies. Traditional Blackwell Communications employees began embracing digital approaches as they witnessed their effectiveness, while Net Democracy's technology specialists gained appreciation for the relationship management expertise of their more experienced colleagues. 1 year after the acquisition closing, Blackwell Digital Communications had established itself as an innovative leader in integrating traditional telecommunications infrastructure with cloud-based services. Industry publications regularly cited the organization as a case study in successful digital transformation within established telecommunications providers. Client growth and financial performance exceeded projections, validating the strategic rationale for the combination. More importantly, the culture that emerged combined the best elements of both organizations: Net Democracy's technological innovation and Blackwell Communications' relationship focus, creating something stronger than either component independently. To mark this milestone, Grandma Helen organized a private dinner at her retirement community in Vermont, bringing together the key figures in my personal and professional journey: my parents, Marcus and Sophia, Professor Liang, Naomi Chen, Victoria, Sanchez, and several early Net Democracy team members who had remained through the integration process. The gathering represented the culmination of my vision for reconciliation, acknowledging past differences without allowing them to define future relationships. Professional respect had created the foundation for personal healing, demonstrating that contrasting approaches could strengthen rather than undermine each other when directed toward shared objectives. During dinner, Grandma Helen proposed a toast that captured the essence of this integration, both organizational and familial. "To the Blackwell legacy," she began, raising her glass, "not as a static inheritance to be preserved unchanged, but as a living tradition constantly renewed through innovation and adaptation." Alexander created a telecommunications company that addressed unmet needs of his era. Richard preserved and strengthened it through decades of industry consolidation. Eliza has now transformed it for the digital age. Different approaches united by common purpose, serving clients with integrity while embracing necessary evolution. The toast acknowledged each generation's legitimate contribution while recognizing that leadership requires different approaches in different eras. This perspective offered a framework for reconciliation without requiring anyone to disavow their genuine beliefs or historical decisions. As the evening concluded, my father approached me privately. "I've been thinking about the $1 million we provided for Marcus's transition," he said, referencing the disparity that had so painfully symbolized the imbalanced treatment of my brother and me. "While that specific opportunity has passed, I believe in addressing inequities rather than merely acknowledging them. Your mother and I would like to establish a personal investment fund of equal value for you, not connected to the company, but for whatever purpose you deem appropriate." The gesture was meaningful, but I had a different perspective on how such resources might best be utilized. "I appreciate the intention behind that offer," I replied, "but I'd prefer something different, not personal funds, but an expansion of the Digital Innovation Fund's scope to include educational initiatives for young people from underrepresented backgrounds interested in telecommunications." He considered this for a moment, then nodded with evident respect for the suggestion. "That's a more meaningful use of resources, creating opportunities rather than just balancing accounts. We can establish a scholarship program as part of the YE Fund." "The Blackwell Innovation Scholarships," I suggested, honoring Grandpa's original vision of expanding access. "Perfect," he agreed. "And perhaps Helen would consider serving as honorary chair, given her role in preserving that vision through multiple generations." This redirection of what might have been personal compensation into institutional opportunity reflected how far both of us had evolved. From the family dynamics of scarcity and favoritism toward a perspective of collaborative contribution and shared purpose. 2 years after the acquisition, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the Telecommunications Evolution Summit, the industry's premier conference examining the future of connectivity infrastructure. Standing on the stage where traditional telecommunications leaders had presented for decades, I reflected on the journey that had brought me there. The most powerful innovations in telecommunications have always come not from rejecting what came before, but from synthesizing established principles with emerging capabilities, I told the audience. The future belongs not to either traditional infrastructure or digital platforms, but to organizations that successfully integrate both, respecting the solid foundations of the past while embracing the transformative potential of what's emerging. The speech received standing ovation, but more meaningful to me was my father's reaction. Seated in the front row beside my mother, he applauded with genuine pride, not the conditional approval of my childhood that depended on conforming to predetermined expectations, but recognition of authentic achievement on my own terms. The reconciliation that had begun through business necessity had evolved into genuine family healing. My relationship with Marcus had improved as well, shifting from implicit competition to mutual respect as we each found our distinct contributions to the family legacy. He continued leading Blackwell's enterprise client division while I focused on digital transformation, our complementary strengths creating more together than either could have achieved independently. My mother, too, had evolved in her understanding, moving beyond passive acceptance of favoritism to active advocacy for equitable family dynamics. She had become particularly involved with the innovation scholarships, personally mentoring several female recipients interested in telecommunications leadership. At a family gathering celebrating Grandma Helen's 80th birthday, Marcus surprised me with an unexpected acknowledgement. "I've been thinking about how differently our parents supported our early efforts," he said as we stood together watching Grandma Helen greeting guests. "I benefited from that imbalance without recognizing it at the time. I'm sorry I didn't see it or speak up about it when I did begin to notice." "We were both navigating the dynamics they created," I replied. "Neither of us designed the system." "No, but I could have questioned it once I was old enough to recognize the pattern," he insisted. Instead, I accepted the advantages as if they were natural rather than constructed. That was a failure of perspective on my part. His recognition represented the final piece of family reconciliation, acknowledgement from the sibling who had benefited from the favoritism that the system itself had been fundamentally unfair. Later that evening, as I helped Grandma Helen arrange her birthday gifts, she handed me a small package. "I've been saving this for the right moment," she explained. "I think today qualifies." Inside was a framed photograph I had never seen, my grandfather in his 20s, standing beside a prototype telecommunications switching system he had designed. The image captured him in a moment of creative intensity, focused on solving a technical challenge rather than posing for the camera. "Alexander kept this in his desk throughout his career," Grandma Helen explained. "Whenever Blackwell Communications drifted toward becoming just another telecommunications provider, he would look at it to remember the innovation that started everything. I think he would be pleased to know it's with you now." The photograph joined my grandfather's desk and chair in my office, another thread connecting the generation that founded Blackwell Communications with its digital transformation. The visual reminder of his innovative spirit affirmed what I had intuitively understood throughout my journey: that honoring legacy means continuing its essential qualities rather than merely preserving its surface manifestations. As I drove back to Seattle the following morning, I reflected on the parallel evolutions in my professional and personal life. The acquisition that had begun as business strategy had facilitated meaningful family reconciliation. The professional respect I had earned through Net Democracy's success had created space for personal healing previously impossible when family dynamics centered on comparison rather than appreciation of different strengths. Most importantly, the journey had transformed my relationship with achievement itself. No longer seeking validation through external recognition, I had built success aligned with my authentic values and vision. The approval that eventually came from my father, from industry peers, from the broader telecommunications community was meaningful, but no longer essential to my identity or sense of worth. The modest laptop that had once symbolized dismissal of my aspirations had ultimately led to transformation far beyond what either my parents or I could have anticipated. In pursuing my own path, despite their lack of support, I had not only achieved professional success, but ultimately created the conditions for meaningful family reconciliation. Blackwell Digital Communications represented not just a successful business combination, but a model for integration of traditional infrastructure and cloud technology, of relationship management and digital efficiency, of past wisdom and future possibility. The organization embodied the principle that different perspectives need not compete destructively, but could instead complement each other toward shared objectives when approached with mutual respect and recognition of complementary strengths. This principle, applied to both business strategy and family relationships, had transformed limitation into opportunity, competition into collaboration, and separation into connection. The journey wasn't completed, but rather continuing along a healthier trajectory, one that honored different contributions while pursuing shared purpose. The laptop that once represented painful dismissal had become the first step on a path leading to outcomes no one involved could have predicted, demonstrating that sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with the most modest and unexpected catalysts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.